In the last two lectures, we considered American conservatism in the years between the two world wars. Now I'd like to recross the Atlantic Ocean and look at British conservatism between the wars. Nearly 1 million British soldiers died in the catastrophe of World War I, and Britain emerged from the ordeal sobered and psychologically wounded. Politically, the war had struck a mortal blow to the Liberal Party, as Labour emerged to take its place in the two-party system. The Conservatives held office throughout most of the interwar years, while Labour struggled to demonstrate, not very convincingly, that it could govern. The parties created a coalition in reaction to the emergency conditions of the Great Depression. The Conservative leaders, Bonar, Austen Chamberlain and Stanley Baldwin, were second-raters, lacking in charisma. They could do little to change the perception that Britain's greatest days were past, that its empire must soon come to an end, and that high levels of unemployment and poverty were destined to be permanent features of British industrial life. Worst of the lot was Neville Chamberlain, who made the fatal error in the late 1930s of appeasing rather than resisting the ambitious new German leader Adolf Hitler. Winston Churchill, who defected to the Liberal Party in 1904, defected back to the Conservatives in 1924. But lacked the full support of his colleagues, many of whom looked on him as a man of doubtful loyalty and as a vestige of the old Victorian era, one who still thought in terms of Britain as an imperial great power. The crisis of 1939 and 1940, however, which proved how wrong Chamberlain had been, also marked a sudden rise in Churchill's fortunes. Vindicated by events, he was called to the premiership in May 1940 and revitalised British prestige, morale and willpower during the dangerous months of the Battle of Britain. Well, Conservatives had dominated the coalition government of World War I and much of the politics of the 1920s. When the First War began, the Liberals under Asquith were in power. But the disastrous failure of early British offensives on the Western Front, plus Asquith's mood of half-heartedness as a war leader, led to an internal coup in the Liberal Party. David Lloyd George, previously the Chancellor, took over as Prime Minister and then created a coalition government with leading Conservatives and with some pro-war Labour members like Arthur Henderson. There was a split in the Labour Party because the organisation of socialist parties around the world, the Second International, had said, if a war breaks out, it's going to be a capitalist war, and we the working people ought to have nothing to do with it. When the war actually came, the working men of Germany mainly joined the German army, the working men of France mainly joined the French army, and so on. But at the top level of the socialist parties there was a split. Henderson was pro-war and became the first Labour Party member to be a cabinet minister. This coalition won the election of 1918 under the leadership of Lloyd George once the war was over, and the election took place immediately after the end of the fighting. Ironically, this government, led by a Liberal but full of prominent Conservatives, then had to yield to Irish independence, despite its determination to go to any lengths to prevent it in the years before the war. Because during the war, the Dublin Uprising had taken place, and Easter Day of 1916, the uprising of the Irish Republicans, the rising itself had been a failure, but it had inspired the rise of Sinn Féin, the political manifestation of a direct action approach to Home Rule. It was far, far more radical and more determined and more militant than the Parliamentary Home Rule Party under Redmond had been. But even now, the Conservatives continue to hold out on behalf of the idea that the 6 Ulster counties in the north of Ireland, whose population was predominantly Protestant, should remain part of the United Kingdom. A Conservative victory in 1922, the next election, marked the final eclipse of the Liberal Party, and it never again held office after that. The wartime coalition, which had won the election of 1918, broke up. And the election showed that the Conservatives, just as they had adapted to new forms of property in the 19th century, absorbing the leading businessmen, had now adapted to the rise of Labour and would remain the second principal party in the system. In America, the crisis of the 1850s destroyed the Whigs, the American Whig Party, and gave rise to the Republicans, who've been one of the dominant two parties ever since. In Britain, the crisis of World War I destroyed the Liberals and made Labour and Conservatives the two principal contenders for power ever since. In both the British and the American political systems, we have winner-take-all democracies. We don't have proportional representation. In countries which do practice proportional representation, many of the democracies of Western Europe since World War II, a party that gets 20% of the vote will also get 20% of the seats in the Assembly. But it's common for an American or British party to get 20% of the votes to get almost no seats at all. The advantage of the proportional representation is that it's more representational of the point of view of the voters. But then it necessitates the creation of alliances between parties which are often unstable, whereas the British and the American winner-take-all system, which only leaves room really for two parties, is more stable, even if it's a little bit less representative. Well, in 1922, Conservatives who voted against the ending of the coalition were afraid that Labour might overwhelm them. The Labour Party had rewritten its constitution during the war, and according to Clause 4 of the new Labour Party constitution, the party was explicitly committed to abolishing capitalism and introducing socialism. They planned to do it procedurally, which differentiated them from the revolutionary socialists of Russia. But nevertheless, the prospect of the abolition of capitalism was a terrifying prospect. Still, the reality is that the Conservatives won in 22. Another mark of the Conservatives' success is that through the whole 20th century, they managed to hold on to a large share of working class people's votes, without which they could never have won an election at all once all the people of Britain could in fact vote. And this is a tribute both to the skill of Conservative electioneering and also to the power of deference and to the very widespread denial of the idea of human equality. America today is so imbued with the idea of human equality that it's very difficult to remember how the disavowal of that idea has been almost universal throughout almost all societies throughout the history of the world. Stanley Baldwin replaced Bonar law early in the new Conservative administration. And it's Stanley Baldwin, not Winston Churchill, who's really the central Conservative figure of the interwar years. Baldwin was Prime Minister from 1922 to 23, from 25 to 29, and again from 1935 to 1937. He was the son of a manufacturer, and he himself had a great talent for business. He helped to adapt the Conservative Party to its image as the party of the rising middle classes throughout England. And in 1922, he was chosen to be the leader of the party over against Lord Curzon, the stiff-necked aristocrat and the former Viceroy of India, whom we've met on 2 or 3 occasions in the course. It was a bitter disappointment to Curzon that he never was able to realise his ambition of becoming Prime Minister. But the middle-class man Baldwin was much better suited to the new realities of the party. Baldwin was probably the first Conservative Prime Minister in British history who actually believed in democracy and believed in social reconciliation, a natural harmony between the different social classes. Listen to his description of the family business where he grew up. A place where I was able to talk with the men, not only about the troubles in the works, but troubles at home, and their wives. It was a place where strikes and lockouts were unknown. It was a place where the fathers and grandfathers of the men then working there had worked, and where their sons went automatically to the business. It was a place where nobody ever got the sack, and where we had a natural sympathy for those who were less concerned in efficiency than is this generation, and where a large number of old gentlemen used to spend their days sitting on the handles of wheelbarrows, smoking their pipes. Well, that's a lovely description of British industry, especially in those days. Not particularly efficient, not particularly swashbuckling, but rather a family affair which keeps on the same families as the workforce from one generation to the next. The company thrived during the First World War, and Baldwin got richer because of it. But at the end of the war, he gave 1/5 of his fortune to the nation, a personal contribution to help repay the massive national debt which had been incurred in the winning of the war. Winston Churchill is widely regarded as the greatest British Conservative of the 20th century. Yet in many respects he was unrepresentative. He came from one of the great old noble families, yet he made his living as a journalist and writer. He was garrulously talkative, at home in any company, an adventurer. His early life had been spent in the army, and first in India and then in Africa. He pulled strings because he was very highly connected. He was able to call in favours from relatives so that he could get to the points of maximum danger, first in India on the northwest frontier, then in the Sudan, where he took part in the Battle of Omdurman, then in the Boer War in South Africa. And in each of the campaigns in which he served, he then wrote books about them, which established his reputation as a writer. Churchill was first elected to Parliament as a Conservative in 1900. And as I said in an earlier lecture, he crossed the floor to join the Liberals in 1904, in protest against Joseph Chamberlain's tariff proposals. His ascent to senior ministerial positions came under the patronage of the Liberal leaders Asquith and Lloyd George. Churchill supported Lloyd George in the People's Budget Crisis and the Parliament Act that followed, and had the effect of diminishing the power of the House of Lords. While still in his 30s, he was made First Lord of the Admiralty, presiding over the greatest navy in the entire history of the world. There was a very rapid build-up of the Royal Navy between 1900 and 1914, partly to keep pace with the sudden rise of the German Navy, which had been so heavily influenced by the work of Alfred Thayer Mahan, which we looked at earlier. The failure of Churchill's Gallipoli scheme during the First World War discredited Churchill and led him to resign his ministerial position and go off to serve for a year on the Western Front. His idea was, the idea of the Gallipoli campaign was to attack not Germany frontally on the Western Front, but rather to attack its weak ally Turkey, force a rapid Turkish surrender, and therefore diminish the strategic position of the Central Powers. But it backfired. Gallipoli turned out to be very, very difficult to capture. It didn't lead rapidly to the overrunning of Istanbul. Instead, the British armies were pinned down just a little way inland from the beaches and eventually had to withdraw ignominiously. It's very well remembered in the movie Gallipoli. Feeling disgraced, Churchill then went to serve on the Western Front, and the Western Front's become a byword for the horror and futility of warfare. But characteristically, Churchill loved it and wrote enthusiastic letters back to his wife about the challenges of being an officer out there in the trenches. But he was too valuable to the government to be left there. He was recalled by Lloyd George and was made Minister of Munitions in the closing stages of the First World War, where he presided over a rapid escalation in the output of the British munitions industry. Lloyd George recognised his exceptional ability, his energy, his optimism and his determination to win. Churchill finally rejoined the Conservative Party in 1924 and then was made Chancellor of the Exchequer under Stanley Baldwin from 1925 to 29. But his outspokenness and his tactlessness throughout the 1930s kept him out of office. Although during those same years, the 1930s, his conservatism became steadily more emphatic. It was partly because of the rapidity of changes in his lifetime. And he said, "Scarcely anything material or established, which I was brought up to believe was permanent and vital, has lasted. Everything I was sure or taught to be sure was impossible, has happened." Right from the beginning, Churchill was a passionate opponent of the Russian Revolution and a fanatical anti-communist. He wrote about communism, the ideology of communism, as a kind of plague, and in many of his books from the early 20s right through into the 1950s, he constantly refers to communism as a plague and to Lenin and Stalin as being something like plague-bearing rats or bacteria. For example, in his book The Aftermath, describing the post-revolutionary situation in Russia, which coincided with the worldwide flu epidemic, he says this: "Not a wounded Russia only, but a poisoned Russia, an infected Russia, a plague-bearing Russia, a Russia of armed hordes, smiting not only with bayonet and with cannon, but accompanied and preceded by swarms of typhus-bearing vermin, which slew the bodies of men, and political doctrines which destroyed the health and even the soul of nations. It was Churchill who organised a British military campaign in Russia immediately after the end of the First World War, in the hope that the counter-revolutionaries could win and restore either the Tsars or the republic which had briefly replaced the Tsars. But Churchill underestimated Trotsky's military effectiveness as leader of the Red Army, and he'd overestimated the Anglo-Americans' ability to support the counter-revolutionary campaign, which ended in failure. And of course it had the effect of greatly souring relations between the Soviet Union on the one hand and the British and the Americans on the other. Churchill remained absolutely dedicated to the British Empire, especially to British India, at a time when both major parties had begun to doubt its durability. By the 1920s, many politicians from all points on the British compass were beginning to think that sooner or later India would have to be given self-government. To Churchill, this was partly a matter of preserving British greatness, that the Indian Empire had been one of the things that made Britain great. But it was also because he foresaw that if the British left, there would be a murderous civil war in India between the Muslims and the Hindus. And in this respect, he was absolutely right, because horrible massacres did attend the creation of independent India and Pakistan. In 1929, Churchill created the Indian Empire Society, and that had the effect of drawing to him the support of the conservative right wing, who also opposed the idea that India should be made what was called a dominion, that is, having limited self-government in everything except foreign policy matters. Churchill was always scornful of Gandhi. Now, Gandhi is one of the people who by our day has become a saint. He's become almost too good to criticise. But during Gandhi's lifetime, he was a very controversial figure, and Churchill was dismissive of him. And he deplored the fact that the Viceroy of India was willing to negotiate with him, and in doing so give Gandhi more status than he otherwise would have had. Churchill wrote, "It was alarming to see Mr. Gandhi, a seditious Middle Temple lawyer, now posing as a fakir of a type well known in the East, striding half naked up the steps of the vice-regal palace, while he is still organising and conducting a defiant campaign of civil disobedience to parley on equal terms with the representative of the King Emperor." Churchill added, "It is never possible to make concessions to Orientals when they think you are weak or afraid of them." That sounds very much like the rhetoric of Albert Beveridge, the Indiana senator, who previously said, "You've got to have different standards when you're dealing with Orientals." Well, Churchill never doubted that war was a permanent part of the human condition, and he hated the industrialisation of warfare. At Omdurman in 1898, he'd taken part in the very last cavalry charge in the history of the British Empire and wrote a very exciting account of it in his book The River War. In the 1930s, Churchill wrote about the transformation of war in the 20th century and the degradation of what had once been a noble calling. He wrote, "War, which used to be cruel and magnificent, has now become cruel and squalid. It is all the fault of democracy and science. From the moment that either of these meddlers and muddlers was allowed to take part in actual fighting, the doom of war was sealed. Instead of a small number of well-trained professionals championing their country's cause with ancient weapons and a beautiful intricacy of archaic manoeuvre, sustained at every moment by the applause of their nation, we now have entire populations, including even women and children, pitted against one another in brutish mutual extermination, and only a set of bleary-eyed clerks left to add up the butcher's bill. From the moment democracy was admitted to, or rather forced itself upon, the battlefield, war ceased to be a gentleman's game." The severity of the Great Depression led to the creation of another coalition government from 1931 to 1935, this time under the leadership of Ramsay MacDonald, the Labour leader. But it gave no office to Churchill. He was opposed to the idea of an alliance with the socialists, even the very mildest ones like Ramsay MacDonald. And he kept up a ceaseless stream of anti-government rhetoric throughout the early 30s, rejecting the government's appeals for national unity in the face of the Depression. Churchill and Neville Chamberlain embodied the two sides of British conservatism in the late 1930s and at the beginning of World War II. Churchill was the first major British politician to anticipate a renewed military threat from Hitler's Germany. The hope for no more wars was so profound in Britain in the 20s and 30s, and Churchill's attitude so dogged that he seemed to many people to be a Cassandra, a bringer of bad news, or to some people he seemed to be a dinosaur, a vestige left over from an older and more brutal era. At first, his warnings about the rising ambitions of Hitler and the rising danger of Nazi Germany fell on deaf ears. But as Hitler's power increased in Europe, so did British conservative willingness to rearm gradually gather also. The historian Paul Johnson describes the way in which the British left and the British right started thinking about Hitler as the 1930s went on, in a very shrewd passage. He says, "The English right did not greatly object to what Hitler was doing inside Germany. In some ways it met with their approval. They certainly did not regard the nature of the Third Reich as justification for an anti-German posture. Some of them had wanted an ideological crusade against Soviet Russia in the 1920s. On the other hand, they began to object strongly to what Hitler was seeking to do outside Germany. This was the kind of old-fashioned aggression they recognised and resented. With the left, it was the other way round. They deplored the Hitler regime, but they thought it wrong to deny Germany the right to seek to modify an unjust peace settlement." That's a very good and terse description of the way in which the British left and right looked at what was happening in Germany. But then Hitler began to persecute the Jews. And then he aided Franco in the Spanish Civil War, most famously with the bombing of Guernica, which brought forth Picasso's great painting. That had the effect of bringing together the divided sides of British politics. And Johnson carries on. What was once seen as a bulwark of social stability was now revealed as its enemy. Hitler, in Tory eyes, ceased to be a conservative and was recognised as a dangerous radical. Well, Neville Chamberlain continued to hope that appeasement and conciliation of Hitler would preserve the peace. Chamberlain had taken over the prime ministership from Stanley Baldwin in 1937, and his policy over the next 2 years was one of appeasement. He hoped that by offering concessions to Hitler, and by offering to work with him diplomatically, they'd be able to preserve the peace of Europe and prevent another catastrophic war from breaking out. We tend to look back on Neville Chamberlain as a ridiculous figure, but of course, it's always easy to be wise after the event. Neville Chamberlain had had a very distinguished career in domestic politics. Like Stanley Baldwin, he was an advocate of social harmony and moderation. He was the son of Joseph Chamberlain, one of the senior Conservatives of the 1880s and 90s, and the man who'd become first Lord Mayor of Birmingham, and then a Liberal, and then had switched over to the Conservatives because he felt so strongly about the Irish question back in the 80s. Neville was also the brother of Austin Chamberlain, who'd been Conservative leader in the early 1920s. So it was a very distinguished family, which since the 1880s had stood front and centre in the middle of the Conservative Party. He was much more of an establishment figure than Churchill. And I think we can sympathise surely with any politician who wants to avoid war if it can be avoided. Certainly Chamberlain was the hero of the moment and won rapturous applause for conciliating Hitler at Munich in 1938, even though that's now looked back on as one of his greatest blunders. The King, George VI, was so enthusiastic that he invited Neville Chamberlain and his wife to join him and the Queen on the balcony of Buckingham Palace to greet the people, an honour never previously given to any Prime Minister. Hitler's continued aggression soon shattered the delusory hopes of Munich, and Britain declared war when Hitler invaded Poland in September 1939. By then it was clear that Churchill, in issuing grim tidings of the ambitions of Hitler, had proved to be right. Chamberlain invited Churchill back to join the government as First Lord of the Admiralty, the position he'd also held at the beginning of the First World War, more than 20 years previously. And then successive disasters in early 1940 led to Chamberlain's resignation. Even then, it wasn't clear that Churchill was going to take over as Prime Minister. Establishment Conservatives, that is, central figures in the party over the last few decades, would have preferred Lord Halifax over Churchill to be the next leader of the party. But Halifax was in the House of Lords, as his title would suggest, and he was very serious about considering the possibility of a compromise peace with Hitler. Once Hitler had invaded and conquered Poland and then the Netherlands and France, it seemed very unlikely indeed that Britain would ever be able to effectively fight back against him. So Halifax's prospect of a conciliatory peace was still attractive to some Conservatives. But Churchill got the job. Churchill was determined not to conciliate. And the fact that he got the job was annoying to many mainstream Conservatives. For example, Nancy Dugdale, who was an influential woman in the Tory world, wrote that she and her friends hated Churchill's broadcasts, the broadcasts which have now made him so famous, regarding them as boastful rather than inspiring. She even claimed that Churchill was the English counterpart of Goering. She said, full of desire for blood, blitzkrieg, and bloated with ego. The mainstream Tories deplored Churchill's shady friends who came into high office with him. But in fact, Churchill was very tactful. On becoming Prime Minister, he was very careful to give senior positions in his government to Halifax and to Chamberlain, and to try to conciliate the two sides of the party, which had been divided through much of the 30s. When he first entered the House of Commons as the new Prime Minister, only the Labour members of the coalition government cheered him. The Conservatives held their cheers for Neville Chamberlain, whom they regarded as a wronged man. This is in May of 1940. In the ensuing months, however, Churchill gradually won over the Conservative sceptics, thanks largely to British success in the Battle of Britain. This was the air war in the desperate months of the summer and fall of 1940, when the Royal Air Force managed to fight the Luftwaffe to a standstill and therefore prevent Hitler from launching the intended invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion. Churchill's eagerness for rearming in the 1930s had finally stimulated the rapid build-up of defensive fighter aircraft, the Spitfires and the Hurricanes, which showed their mettle when it came to the point in the Battle of Britain. They showed their value in destroying the German bomber campaign and making German command of the air impossible. Churchill was also able to mobilise enough ships to get the British Expeditionary Force back from Dunkirk as the German armies overran France. Dunkirk was really a horrifying retreat, although it was very rapidly depicted in British propaganda as a great strategic withdrawal. Churchill then made a succession of parliamentary speeches for which he's now best remembered. Perhaps one of his most famous lines was this, referring to the Spitfire pilots: "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." He also expressed an absolute determination never to surrender. But it's worth remembering that he still wasn't technically a Conservative Prime Minister. He was the Conservative leader of a national coalition. He was very preoccupied by the war itself, and most domestic affairs inside Britain during the war were taken care of by his Deputy Prime Minister, the Labour Party leader, Clement Attlee. Still, Churchill had understood the importance of conciliating the leading Conservatives, including Chamberlain, and therefore, when it was offered to him, he declined to accept the party leadership. He said, "I am of course a Conservative, but as Prime Minister of a national government formed on the widest basis and comprising the three parties, I feel that it would be better for me not to undertake the leadership of any one party." In November of 1940, by which time it was pretty clear that the Battle of Britain was won, Neville Chamberlain died of cancer, and there was no longer a central figure around whom the anti-Churchill Conservatives could gather. From then on, his success as a war leader gradually reconciled the Conservative rank and file to Churchill's leadership.